Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. Today we have a really exciting group of animals to talk about. But before we get into that, how's everybody doing? Hope you're happy, hope you're healthy, hope you're having some fun. But today's group of animals is a very dynamic group of animals, very enjoyable to watch, very exciting, very playful. Today we're going to be talking about otters in this Critter Chat number 32. When I first learned that there were 13 species of otters, my mind was blown. I thought that there were maybe 2 or 3, maybe a couple more than that, but I was very surprised to learn that there were 13 species of otters. I was very familiar with North American otters and sea otters that live off the west coast of the United States. And I'd maybe seen 1 or 2 others in zoos, but I had no idea there were 13. I was also surprised to find out that they live across most of the world. They live in North and South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So they're on all the continents except Antarctica and Australia. In many of those places, most of them are freshwater dwelling otters that live up in freshwater lakes, rivers, and streams. And there are 2 otters that live in an ocean environment. The sea otters in North America on the west coast, and they go a little bit over into northern Asia. And then there's a species of otter down in South America on the Pacific coast, on the west coast, called the marine otter. Today we're going to focus a little bit more on the freshwater otters. We'll touch a little bit on the sea otters, but I want to do another separate episode on them as well, because they're a little bit different than most of the others. So we're going to focus a little more on the freshwater otters today. First of all, let's talk about some commonalities between all the species of the otters. They share a lot of similar characteristics between all of them. For starters, they kind of have small ears and a short snout or a short nose. Both their ears and their nose, they can close up when they go underwater, which is pretty remarkable, but it makes sense for an animal who's both on land and aquatic to be able to do that, to help them be better swimmers. As far as their body shape, they're pretty elongated. They're longer than they are tall. And compared to other animals of their size, they're definitely a bit longer than other mammals, kind of in their weight range. They also typically have long tails and a soft, dense, waterproof fur. Most of them also have some webbing between their digits on their feet and on their hands. Some of them, it's more webbing than others, and some have webbing on only one set of their feet, usually the hind feet, if they don't have it on the front. So let's talk a little bit about size. So the smallest otters are the Asian small-clawed otters. They're just under 3 feet in length, so they're pretty small. That includes a pretty big tail, and they weigh in at about 11 pounds. Now the largest otters depends on what we're going for, because there's a different answer based on their length or based on their weight. So the longest ones are the giant river otters. These are a species that live in the rainforest, in the rivers of South America. And they are huge lengthwise. They're between 5 and 6 feet long. So I'm 6'1", so they are almost as long as I am tall. So they are very, very long animals. But they are not the heaviest. The heaviest otters are the sea otters, specifically the northern subspecies of sea otters. They're the ones that live up by Alaska. They can weigh in at about 90 pounds for a big male. The giant river otters, they're not quite that heavy. They're more in the 50 to maybe 70 pound range. So those sea otters up in Alaska, they're a bit heavier, but they're a bit shorter. They're a little more stocky build than their longer cousins that live in the rainforest. So otters are part of a group of family called the Mustelidae family, or the mustelids. If you think of that word, it's kind of a funny word, but it sounds a little bit like musk. And they all kind of have that kind of feature in common. They have a gland on their body that secretes an oil and also scent. And they're all a little bit stinky, subspecies more than others. But their scent glands is a very important way that they mark their territories and that they're able to communicate with each other. Specifically, most of the river otters will rub that scent gland kind of from, it's usually based near their tail, but they'll rub it all over their fur, and then they'll rub their neck, they'll rub their arms, they'll rub their belly, all across different logs and rocks in their environment to help mark their territory. Now their bodies, they're covered with this dense fur. They usually have 2 layers of fur, kind of a softer underlayer that's really short, and a longer layer of hair that kind of sticks out a little further that they sometimes call guard hairs. And that one's a little more oily. And that's important for otters to stay warm. So unlike some of the other water-dwelling mammals, they're not so big, they're not so fat, they don't have that thick layer of body fat called blubber to help keep them warm. And some of the otters live in very cold areas with very cold water. And so they need to stay warm, and that thick, dense fur coat helps in that a lot. So the softer underlayer of hair traps a lot of bubbles of air, and that helps insulate and keep their body heat in. You'll see that if you ever see an otter dive into the water, you'll see a lot of air bubbles come off. So that's some of the air escaping. But a lot of it does stay on, and that actually keeps them quite dry underneath down at the skin level. Now those longer hairs, they also kind of coat those with some of that gland that we were talking about earlier with kind of an oily substance, and that helps to kind of keep them waterproof. And that's very important if you're going to live in cool or cold water. Now, so this nice fur coat that they have is also some of the most dense fur of any animals. In fact, the sea otters, the ones that live off the west coast of the United States, they have the densest fur of any animal anywhere on Earth. And within about 1 square inch, or about this big around, they have about 1 million hairs. So humans, we usually have between 60 and 100,000 hairs all on our head. So it takes between 10 to maybe 12 or 15 of us, all the hairs on our head, to equal what a sea otter has in just 1 square inch. So that's a lot of hair. But that hair, like I mentioned, is very important in helping them to stay warm and helping them to stay dry. And they spend a lot of time to take care of that hair because they know it's so important to them. So otters spend a lot of time grooming, and some species more than others, but taking care of their hair or their fur is very, very important to them. And so they will kind of scratch through it with their hands to kind of move it around and make sure it's clean. They don't really lick their hair like a dog or a cat does. They more use their paws or their hands to kind of rub through their hair. And then the places they can't reach, they'll scratch on a rock or a log to kind of help move that around. And in moving that around, it gets those little tiny short hairs to kind of spread apart a little more, and that gets the air trapped in between those little hairs so that they're waterproof the next time they dive into the water. So otters are also very energetic and usually very playful. Now some, they don't have quite as much time to play as others. Particularly the river otters, the freshwater species, have a little more time on their hands. It's a little easier for them to live their life. They don't have to worry about staying as warm, and they don't have to work as hard for their food. So they have a little more free time. Also, a lot of them live in family groups, so they have help to raise the kids, with it being either a mate, the mom and the dad are both present, or sometimes the older siblings are around to help out as well. With sea otters, it's usually one mom with one baby. She has a lot to do to keep her and her baby fed and safe. She has a little less time for play. But sea otters will play when they have time. The river otters, they love to play. So that will be a different depending on where they are and what they're doing. They'll sometimes chase each other around. They'll roll around on the ground quite a bit. They love to slide. If there's a hillside, they'll slide through mud, through snow, through grass to get down to where their water source is. And play is very important to an otter, and they're one of the few animals that has exhibited play or doing things just for the fun of it as adults. And that's something that I think makes a lot of people be extra impressed or curious about otters. And otters themselves are actually quite curious. They're also very intelligent, and they will use that curiosity and intelligence to kind of deal with some of their threats or dangers in the wild, particularly in watching out for predators. If there's a group of otters together and there's a predator that's maybe a little hesitant or just kind of checking things out, the otters will sometimes use their numbers to try to scare off the predator. And it's quite successful in some situations. Now, depending on what kind of species of otter they are and where they're living, where they're located, they may have different types of predators. But for some of them, that's a bird of prey. It may be a big snake. It may be a cat, like the South America species would need to worry about jaguars. Some of the African species would worry about the big predators there. And many of the species, especially in the tropics, need to worry about crocodiles or alligators or caimans that may try to eat them as well. So all of those predators would be a potential risk for them. And the otters that live in groups particularly have a lot of vocal communication. So they make a lot of sounds to each other. They can be friendly sounds, they can be warning sounds. They can also kind of tell each other off to help protect their territory. But these would include things like whistles, growls, screams, barks, chirps, moans, and coos. I've heard a bunch of those from the different animals. Definitely some that I've worked with in a zoo setting have been pretty vocal at times. Now, some of the otters, particularly the river otters, and I guess all the otters except for the sea otters, usually have a den or a place that they'll go to sleep at night. The sea otters, the ones off of the coast of North America, they just kind of hang out in the water most of the time and very rarely come to land. And so they'll sleep out there floating in the water. But the others, they usually have like a little space that they'll go. That's sometimes a burrow, like a hole dug in the side of the river or near a lake or in a mud bank. Sometimes it's just underneath a pile of rocks. They'll kind of find a little crevice there that they can hide out in. And sometimes, particularly with the North American river otters and the European otters, they'll sometimes steal homes from beavers. Beavers are great home builders. We've talked about that in our beaver episode, and otters will sometimes chase the family of beavers away, especially if they're older, weak, or sick beavers. They can sometimes chase them off and take over their home. And it's a nice home, so I can kind of understand why the otters may want it. Now, otters are carnivores. That means they eat other animals. They will, on rare occasions, eat some fruit or maybe some vegetables, some plant matter. But by and large, they are carnivores. So they eat other animals. For a lot of the freshwater species, that's usually fish, although it may also include things like crayfish or snails or possibly some like freshwater clams and other things along that nature. They would also sometimes go after things that aren't in the water, things like little birds or small mammals, small reptiles. Now, the ocean-dwelling otters, they're going to usually go after other things besides fish. So they're going to go after things like crabs, shrimp, urchins, abalone, all sorts of good things. In fact, the sea otters, the ones off of the coast of North America, don't actually eat fish in most of their range, just on occasion. But otters, we mentioned a little bit earlier, they're part of that mustelid family. So that means they're related to things like weasels and ferrets and badgers and wolverines. So they are carnivores with very sharp teeth, and they can be pretty aggressive when they need to be or when they want to be, and that helps them in hunting. Typically for otters, they have different social structures depending on their species. So like I mentioned, the sea otters, it's a mom with just her one baby. She'll only have one baby at a time. Twins have been observed maybe a couple of handfuls of times, but usually they don't survive. She needs to kind of have just one baby to look after. And the dad usually isn't around. So he comes, they breed, they have a baby, the mom raises the baby by herself. With some of the species of otters, the mom and the dad kind of hang out together for quite a while. And then when the babies are born, she chases dad off. And sometimes he comes back and helps raise the pups, and sometimes he doesn't. It depends kind of more on the species. Now, some species like the giant river otters, both the mom and the dad are active in raising the babies together. And sometimes they even have an older generation of siblings to help out too. So in their group, they can have a mom and a dad and maybe 3 or 4 older kids and 3 or 4 more that are the younger kids, the kids of this year. And so they sometimes live in family groups with as many as 10. There's a few species of the Asian otters that also live in family groups like that. With that though, the giant river otters are sometimes called the wolves of the river. They're pretty good size, they're very excellent hunters, and they kind of roam around in this pack of up to 10 animals. So I can see why they get their name. And I remember the first time I saw or heard of giant river otters, I was watching a documentary on Animal Planet, and they talked about them and showed them, and I'd never heard of them before. And I was blown away by how big they are, how quick they move, and how aggressive hunters they were. And it was pretty impressive. Now, otters, when they dive under the water, whether they're in the ocean or a river or a lake, they usually can hold their breath about 5 minutes, which may not seem for very much time, but it's usually a lot longer than most people can hold their breath. If you're watching this with kids, that may be a fun activity for you to do. Time your kids. See how long they can hold their breath. See if they can hold their breath as long as an otter can. It's kind of a fun activity. Now, some animals can hold their breath much, much longer. And we've talked about that a bit when we talked about the pinnipeds and when we talked about sea turtles. They can both hold their breaths quite a bit longer than an otter can. So let's move on and talk a little bit about my experience with otters. So I've been lucky in that I've seen 2 kinds of otters out in the wild, both the North American species. So the North American river otters, those are the ones that live in the mountains, lakes, rivers, and streams in North America. And the sea otters, those are the ones that live in the ocean just off the coast of California. And the North American river otters, I've been able to watch them in a couple of places, sometimes just very quickly. In Utah, I saw them briefly. In Alaska, I saw them briefly. But in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, I was able to watch them for a long time. And I watched a little family group. There were 3 otters. I don't know if it was mom and dad and 1 baby, or if it was 3 babies that had kind of left parents but were still hanging together, or if it was a mom with just 2 babies. I don't know who they were. But I watched them eat that day, and they weren't eating a fish, which was really surprising to me. They were eating a duck, and a duck is a pretty good sized meal for something like an otter size. And so I was pretty surprised and impressed that they were able to catch a duck. Ducks are usually pretty quick to move away from predators, so I didn't see them catch it, but I did see them eating it. And one would eat the duck for a while, and then the other one would take it away, and that otter would eat on the duck for a while, and then the third one would take the duck and eat on it. For a while, all 3 of them were biting at the duck at the same time. But they are definitely aggressive hunters and very capable of eating and catching multiple kinds of food. Now, the other species that I've seen were the sea otters, and I was in Monterey, California, right on the coast of Monterey Bay, and that is the best place in the world to see sea otters because there's a very good population of them that live right there. And I had gone to the Monterey Bay Aquarium as a visitor, and I learned about sea otters in their aquarium, saw the sea otters that they had there, and then on their back deck, it overlooks the bay. I could see some sea otters way out floating in the ocean, and I was very happy to see them, but a little sad because they were really far away. After we left the aquarium, we were walking along the shoreline on a little boardwalk, and I looked out, and about 25 feet away were two sea otters playing in the ocean. And I was able to watch them for about 10-15 minutes, and I was much more excited about being able to see them in that time frame, and definitely gained a lot of appreciation in watching them. Now, in my work at zoos, I've also been able to work with different species of otters. In fact, I've worked with 4 species of otters in a zoo setting. First was at the Phoenix Zoo. I worked in the education department, so I didn't directly take care of animals. But one of the things I did is I went around and talked to the people about the animals at the zoo. And sometimes that included feeding the animals while I talked about them. And the otters that we had at the Phoenix Zoo were one of those species. So on those days, when I had that position, I pretty much fed the otters every day that I worked in that job. And that was a very fun and exciting time for me. The otter species that we had there is one that's pretty rare in the United States. It's called the spotted-necked otter. And there's only about 5 or 6 zoos that have them in the US, and the Phoenix Zoo is one of those zoos. Spotted-necked otters come from Africa, which was really exciting to me. I didn't really know that there are otters in Africa before my time working at that zoo. Spotted-necked otters have little white dots on their throats. They're a medium-sized otter, so they're not huge like the big sea otters or the giant river otters. They're not little like the Asian small-clawed otters. They're kind of in the middle. And the really good thing for the Phoenix Zoo having them is that they come from a very hot area of Africa, and so they're very well adapted to living in a hot environment like Phoenix. In Africa, the spotted-necked otters live in a series of very big lakes and some rivers right in eastern Africa. The biggest of those is called Lake Victoria, and that's a huge lake, but spotted-necked otters are common in that area around those Lake Victoria and the other big lakes in that area. The people there in Africa call them the hyenas of the water because they're a pretty aggressive species and will go after a lot of different kinds of animals for their food. So again, they'll go after fish for sure, but they'll also sometimes go after small mammals, birds, or small reptiles. And at the Phoenix Zoo, we actually saw that happen quite a bit. Particularly with squirrels, they would often catch a squirrel. They would sometimes catch a bird. They would sometimes catch things like little lizards, maybe a snake. But they were very good at hunting, even in a zoo setting, and they would often eat what they caught. But those were the spotted-necked otters, a really cool species of otter, really excited that I got to work with them as closely as I did. When I moved to Los Angeles and began my work at the Los Angeles Zoo, I was able to work with 2 different species of otters. One was the North American river otters. Again, those are the same kind I saw in Yellowstone and several other places throughout the US. But in working with them in the zoo setting, I was very excited to see how playful they were. Even though the pair that I worked with at LA were very old, they were still very energetic, very excited to be able to have chances to play. And it was very fun to watch that. The other species I worked with at the Los Angeles Zoo were the giant river otters, which are again the huge ones from South America that live in the Amazon and the other river systems of South America. And they are huge, and they were great to work with. They're incredibly loud. When we were in a building where they would sleep or where we would feed them, it was extremely loud in there when they would vocalize. They can call over a very long distance, and that loud sound helps them to stay together as a tight group. The otter exhibit for the giant river otters at the Los Angeles Zoo is one of the best otter exhibits I've ever seen. It's a really great exhibit for them, and they've done very well there. The Los Angeles Zoo has also been very successful in being able to breed this endangered species. And when at one point they had 8 individuals in that big exhibit. So it was a nice family group with 2 different groups of babies going on. I don't believe they have that many there anymore because some of the babies have grown up and moved to other zoos. But that's an amazing experience to be able to see them at that exhibit, part of the Rainforest of the Americas exhibit complex. If you're ever in Los Angeles, and you go to the LA Zoo, definitely make sure you see that exhibit. Also in my job at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, I've been able to work with sea otters. I don't work directly with them because I'm not a keeper, but as an educator, I get to talk about them and help people watch them and understand them. And also I help lead behind the scenes tours for people to be able to see them and meet them, which is an incredible experience. The sea otters in an aquarium setting definitely are a little more playful than maybe their wild relatives would be. The wild relatives have to worry a little more about survival. The ones at the aquarium, they get food brought to them every day. They don't have to go find and collect it on their own. But incredible species to watch and very cute. One of the popular animal species at the aquarium that people love to be able to see. I've also seen 2 other species of otters in zoos. So Asian small-clawed otters are in a number of zoos here in North America. I specifically remember seeing them at the Bronx Zoo, where they had a nice family group of them. They're one of the species that also lives in a pretty good sized group with mom and dad and multiple babies. Super adorable, super cute species. And I've also seen a Cape clawless otter at the San Diego Zoo, which is another African species that lives down in the southern part of Africa. I was really surprised that it's a fairly good size otter, bigger than the North American otters, bigger than the spotted-necked otters. I also have seen spotted-necked otters there at San Diego Zoo. But otters are very fun to watch. I think a lot of people really enjoy them because they are playful, they're energetic, and they're intelligent and curious. But there are also some threats facing otters, and of the 13 species of otters, 5 of them are listed as endangered. Those are the sea otters, the giant river otters, the marine otters, so the other ocean ones down in South America, the hairy-nosed otters, which live over in Southeast Asia, on the island of Sumatra and some of the surrounding otters, and then the southern river otters, which are also a South American freshwater species that lives kind of in the western part of South America, Peru and Chile and stuff. All of those are listed as endangered. 2 species of otters were, I guess almost 3. 3 species of otters have almost been wiped out by people in the past. The Eurasian river otter, or the European river otter, the North American river otter, and the sea otter were all hunted extensively for their fur, specifically back in like the 16, 17, and 1800s. All 3 of those species were almost hunted to extinction. Luckily, they've all kind of made a bit of a recovery, with the North American river otter making a full recovery to where it is now the least threatened of all 13 river otter species. That's because they put a ban on hunting them or trapping them, and they also introduced them back to former parts of their range where they had been wiped out. The sea otters off the west coast of the United States have bounced back a bit, but they are still threatened and still listed as endangered. So 5 are endangered, 1 is not. That means that that's 6 of the 13. The other 7 are listed as near threatened or vulnerable. So there are a lot of threats facing otters out there in the world. The biggest of those threats is pollution. So pollution for otters can come in a variety of forms. One of the biggest and most problematic are pesticides or poisons that people use to control insects or sometimes rodents or other pest species. It may kill the animals that they're trying to get rid of, the bugs or the mice or the rats, but it may also sometimes kill other animals, and that's a big problem with poison. Also, that poison, if it's out and about in the environment, usually ends up in the river or the water, and it can cause a lot of problems for other animals. Even if it gets watered down, it can cause health issues, and that often affects otters. As the poison gets absorbed into their environment and into the food chain, maybe it's just a little bit of poison that's living inside a fish or is in a fish that then the otter eats, and then it causes problems for the otter. Another problem similarly is fertilizers, things that we spray on crops or trees to help fruit grow or corn or whatever type of plants we're trying to grow, fertilizers, can cause a big part of the problem. With both pesticides and fertilizers, that problem also exists out in the ocean. As the rivers flow downstream, it takes with it those toxins, and that ends up in the food chain for the sea otters as well. And then oil spills is another form of pollution that has caused a lot of problem for sea otters. I remember specifically a big oil spill in Alaska that caused a lot of really bad problems for the sea otters up in that area. For some of the other otters, habitat destruction is a big threat, particularly the otters that live in tropical forest, like the giant river otters and some of those Asian otter species that live in rainforest. When people cut down the trees, they often pollute the area that they're working in, and they sometimes use the river as a way to float the trees out to move them to wherever they're taking the wood, the trees to, and that causes a lot of problems with the river. It also disrupts the whole ecosystem and causes a lot of mud and other debris to come into the water, which then causes problems with the prey species that the otters may be eating, as well as problems for the otters as well. Habitat destruction is a big problem for most animals across the world. Another problem there with habitat destruction is if we build dams, it often impacts the food chain. So food like fish may not be able to thrive as well, and then the otters that rely on those fish don't have as much food to eat. We mentioned a little bit earlier, hunting and trapping for their fur has been historically a big problem for otters. That does still exist occasionally today, more so in developing countries and places where the people are really poor. They may see an otter, they may try to kill it for its fur, knowing that it may have some sort of value to trade for something nicer that they need. And then the final threat facing otters is the illegal pet trade. Yeah, people who are trying to keep otters as a pet. That's especially a problem for the Asian small-clawed otters. They are the smallest. They are super adorable. They're really cute. They're really fun to watch, but they are not a good pet. They are a dangerous animal. Remember, they are related to things like badgers and wolverines. They have sharp teeth. They are capable of biting a finger off. That has happened with people who have owned otters as pets. And often for animals like that who are pets, the parents get killed and the babies get kidnapped, and that's how you end up with a pet like an otter. It is illegal. It is not a very good choice, and I highly discourage it. If you want a pet, get something like a dog or a cat. There's many pet shelters that have those animals available to adopt. Don't get something like an otter. They're cute. Watch videos of them. Go watch some in the zoo. Go find a place where you can see them in the wild. But don't have them as pets, please. That's my rant about anti-otters as pets. I'm not a big fan of any exotic animal being a pet, and there are many reasons why. Also, there's a lot of diseases they can get, and often most veterinarians don't know how to take care of them. If you have an animal like that as a pet, it may have a very serious medical condition, and you may not be able to get the help it needs, and it will have a much shorter lifespan. Okay, enough said about that. I highly encourage you to watch some otters next time you're at a zoo or an aquarium that has them. I'll be putting up some videos and photos later today on some of the other platforms. And if you missed part of this critter chat, you can always catch this full chat or portions of it, or other critter chats, on Facebook or YouTube as I upload the videos every day. So feel free to like, share, subscribe, and follow me across the 3 platforms at ZooNerd, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And until tomorrow, take care of yourself. Be happy, be healthy, be smart, stay home, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.